Welcome to Unpolished by Cold. I'm Kathrin Shaffer. This season moves at a slower pace with less urgency and more attention. These episodes are shaped around faith that forms over time rather than faith that rushes for answers. And I'm glad you're here. There's a particular way faith is supposed to feel, at least according to the stories we tend to tell. It is meant to arrive with clarity. It should feel alive in our bodies. It should move us emotionally, sometimes dramatically, sometimes unmistakably. Faith, we assume, ought to announce itself. If it does not, we begin to wonder what is missing. Many of us learned early on to associate faith with moments that stand out. Moments that feel elevated above ordinary life. Moments where something clicks, where conviction sharpens, where certainty replaces doubt. These moments are not wrong. They can be meaningful, even formative. But somewhere along the way, they became the measuring stick. We began to assume that faith itself should always feel that way. Fireworks make sense as a metaphor because they are impossible to ignore. They are bright and loud and brief, and when they happen, everyone knows it. There's no ambiguity. Something clearly occurred. When faith resembles fireworks, it feels easy to trust it, easy to name it, to remember it. The problem is that fireworks does not last. They flare and vanish, leaving darkness that feels sharper by contrast. And when faith does not continue to sparkle in the same way, we quietly question whether it is still there at all. We start to treat ordinary faith as a downgrade, as if something richer or truer has slipped through our fingers. Most of faith, however, does not arrive as spectacle. Most of faith looks like showing up again. It looks like walking through days that feel unremarkable and choosing not to disengage. It looks like continuing to pray prayers that sound familiar, even to ourselves. It looks like opening scripture and not finding immediate answers, yet staying with the text anyways. It looks like holding on to trust when nothing new seems to be happening. That kind of faith rarely draws attention. It is easy to overlook because it does not create a moment you can point to and say, that's when it happened. It does not resolve neatly. It does not feel efficient. It does not produce a story with a clear beginning, middle, and end. And yet, that is where most of us live. We live in the long middle. The space between what we believed once and what we hope will eventually settle more deeply. The stretch where faith feels less like certainty and more like commitment. Less like inspiration and more like orientation. Orientation matters more than intensity, though we often confuse the two. Intensity feels powerful. Orientation is quieter. Intensity can be measured by emotion. Orientation is measured by direction. A life oriented toward God continues turning in His direction, even when emotion fades, even when clarity wavers. even when enthusiasm fades. That turning does not always feel like movement. Sometimes it feels like standing still while everything else moves around us. Sometimes it feels like repetition, like returning to the same questions, the same doubts, the same practices. It can feel frustrating to realize that faith is not always about arriving somewhere new, but formation rarely works through arrival. It works through staying. Jesus spoke about faith in ways that resist spectacle. Seeds growing in soul, bread eaten daily, lamps kept burning, vines remaining connected. These are not dramatic images. They are domestic, agricultural, ordinary. They depend on care over time rather than moments of brilliance. Seeds grow underground for a long time before anything is visible. Bread sustains because it is eaten again and again, not because it excites. Lamps stay lit because someone keeps filling them with oil. And faith works the same way. Growth happens quietly, often without awareness. Nourishment happens regularly, not in bursts. Light persists because it is tended, not because it flares brightly once. When faith does not feel extraordinary, we sometimes assume it has weakened. We may even worry that God has become distant. That assumption is understandable in a culture that equates presence with sensation. Yet Scripture never promises constant emotional intensity as proof of God's nearness. What it offers, instead, is the assurance of God's faithfulness, steady and unchanging, even when our experience fluctuates. Faith does not disappear when feelings do. It continues beneath the surface, carried by trust rather than sensation. It survives boredom, disappointment, and long stretches of sadness. It is sustained by commitment rather than excitement, and that does not make it fragile. It makes it resilient. We live in a world that prizes visible impact. Results are expected quickly. Progress should be obvious. When those values shape how we think about faith, we begin to measure spirituality by output rather than depth. We ask ourselves what we can show for it, what has changed, what feels different, what can be named. But depth does not always announce itself. Depth often reveals itself later, when we realize that our responses have softened, our patience has lengthened, our trust has become less reactive. These shifts are subtle. They unfold slowly. They rarely feel dramatic in the moment. Faith without fireworks teaches us to notice those subtleties. It invites us to recognize that continuing to show up is not nothing. That staying engaged is not stagnation. That steadiness is not a lack of faith, but often its truest expression. Remaining faithful when nothing feels impressive requires a different kind of trust. It asks us to believe that God is at work even when we cannot point to evidence that satisfies our expectations. It requires us to let go of the need for confirmation and learn to live from orientation instead. And that is not easy. It is far from comfortable to chase moments that feel spiritually alive than to sit with faith that feels boring. But moments do not sustain us. Orientation does. Faith that depends on fireworks often struggles when life settles back into routine. Faith that has learned how to remain continues even when circumstances disappoint and emotions quiet. This is where many of us find ourselves. Not in crisis, not in breakthrough, but in continuity. And it can feel anticlimactic because it does not offer a clear storyline. It does not provide a sense of arrival. It simply asks us to keep going. And maybe that is the invitation. Maybe faith is not meant to be constantly exciting. Maybe it is meant to be constant. Once we begin to accept that faith does not always arrive with spectacle, something else surfaces almost immediately. A quieter discomfort, a kind of unease that does not come from disbelief, but from having fewer emotional markers to lean on. When fireworks disappear, there's no obvious signal telling us whether we are still moving forward or simply standing still. And standing still can feel suspicious. We are not especially good at trusting things we cannot measure. We like evidence we can point to, change we can name, and progress we can chart. When faith settles into something steady rather than dramatic, it becomes harder to tell ourselves a clear story about what is happening. We may still believe, still pray, still show up, yet feel oddly unsure whether it all counts in the same way it once did. This uncertainty is not rebellion. It is exposure. Fireworks shield us from ambiguity. They announce meaning on our behalf. When faith feels intense, we do not have to ask whether God is near or whether we are still responding correctly. When intensity answers those questions for us. When that intensity fades, we are left with trust alone. Trust is quieter than certainty. Trust does not insist on immediate reassurance. It does not demand that God prove himself again and again. It rests on the character of God rather than the experience of God. And that distinction matters more than we often realize. Many of us discover at this stage that we have relied more heavily on experience than we thought. We did not intend to, but we learned to associate God's presence with a particular feeling, a tone of prayer, a particular sense of being spiritually alive. When those sensations recede, it can feel like God has moved, even when nothing in our practices or commitments has changed. Faith without fireworks forces us to confront that gap. It asks us to consider whether we trust God's nearness even when we cannot feel it. Whether we believe his presence is constant or only intermittent. Whether our faith rests on who God is or on how we experience him in a given moment. Those questions are uncomfortable precisely because they cannot be answered quickly. They require us to sit with uncertainty rather than resolve. They invite us into a deeper, slower relationship with God that does not rely on constant affirmation. This kind of faith does not feel triumphant. It feels patient. Sometimes it feels exposed. Sometimes it feels almost fragile, though in truth it is becoming stronger. This is often where fatigue enters the picture. Not the dramatic fatigue of crisis, but the quiet weariness that comes from continuing without reinforcement. We keep praying, but without the sense that anything is shifting. We keep showing up, but without the emotional reward that once accompanied our effort. Over time, we may begin to wonder whether persistence itself is the problem. But persistence is not the problem. The problem is that we have been taught to expect persistence to feel rewarding. In many areas of life, effort is reinforced quickly. We see results. We receive feedback immediately. We experience progress in ways that reassure us we are on the right track. Faith does not always operate according to that pattern. Often, it asks us to continue long before any visible outcome appears. And this is not because God is withholding affirmation. It is because faith is not meant to be sustained by constant reward. Faith that depends on reward remains shallow. Faith that learns how to endure without it becomes rooted. Rootedness takes time. Roots grow in darkness, where nothing about their progress is visible. They spread slowly, often unevenly, responding to conditions beneath the surface. Their work cannot be rushed, and it cannot be forced into neat timelines. Ordinary faith grows the same way. It extends quietly beneath the surface of daily life. It deepens through repetition rather than novelty. It strengthens through continuity rather than intensity. While nothing appears to be happening, something essentially is being established. This is why ordinary faith often feels invisible even to us. We may not notice growth because growth is happening below our awareness. We may not feel change because change is occurring gradually, in increments too small to register day by day. But over time, this invisibility can lead us to underestimate what God is doing. We assume that if growth were real, we would feel it more clearly. But much of that shapes us most profoundly is felt only in retrospect. We realize later that our reactions have softened, that we are less reactive than we once were, that we can sit with uncertainty longer without panicking, that disappointment does not undo us the way it once did, and these shifts do not arrive with ceremony. They appear quietly, almost accidentally, when we look back. Faith without fireworks teaches us to recognize these subtle changes as evidence of real formation. It also reshapes how we understand obedience. Obedience in a fireworks-driven framework is often associated with clarity and confidence. We obey because we feel sure. We act because we feel compelled. When certainty fades, obedience becomes more difficult. Not because we want to resist God, but because we no longer feel anchored by emotional momentum. Ordinary faith asks us to obey without that momentum. It asks us to keep choosing faithfulness even when the reasons feel less vivid. To trust that God is still at work even when we cannot trace the outcome. This kind of obedience does not feel heroic. It feels quiet. Sometimes it feels lonely. Yet, this is the obedience that shapes character. Character is not formed through moments of intensity. It is formed through repeated choices made when no one is watching and nothing feels dramatic. It is shaped through faithfulness that does not depend on recognition. Jesus never presented obedience as something that would always feel satisfying. He spoke of carrying crosses, of losing life in order to find it, of remaining faithful even when the road narrowed. These images do not promise emotional reward. They promise presence. Presence is enough, though it may not always feel like it. Faith without fireworks strips away the illusion that God's work in us should always feel pleasant or affirming. It invites us into a deeper trust, one that rests on God's faithfulness rather than our experience of it. This is where faith becomes less about how we feel and more about who we are becoming. And becoming takes time. It unfolds unevenly. It includes setbacks, plateaus, and long stretches where nothing seems to change. And in these seasons, it is tempting to believe we have stalled, that we are behind, that we should be further along by now. But formation does not follow a straight line. It loops, it revisits familiar ground, it returns to the same lessons from new angles. What feels like repetition is often deepening. What feels like stagnation is often consolidation. Faith without fireworks teaches us to trust that process. It allows us to release the need for constant reassurance. It invites us to stop rating our spiritual life according to how alive it feels. It creates space for faith that is steady rather than spectacular. This kind of faith does not disappear when emotions fade. It remains. It holds. It endures. And endurance matters. Endurance is what allows faith to survive. Disappointment without collapsing. It anchors us when prayer remains unanswered. It keeps us tethered when clarity does not arrive on schedule. Anchors do not prevent storms. They keep us from drifting when storms come. An ordinary faith is anchoring faith. It does not make life easier, but it does make life steadier. It gives us something solid to return to when circumstances shake us. It allows us to remain present rather than scrambling for escape. When faith without fireworks is not a sign that something is missing, it is often a sign that something deeper is being built. And that work, though quiet and slow, is no less sacred. If you'd like to explore resources connected to this season, including the Bible study we're walking through together on Sundays, You can find everything at kathrinshaffer.com. And this podcast will always remain free. And if you're looking for ways to support the work, those options are there as well. Just a reminder, keep walking with Jesus. Steady faith is still real faith. Until next time.